Hello and welcome to our podcast named Detours. This podcast embraces the unexpected twists and turns that shapes the journeys of our lives that God sends us down. I'm your host and fellow traveler, Mike. I'm here with my beautiful wife, Deb, and we invite you to join us on this exploration of uncharted territories we encounter along the way. So without further ado, let's dive into this episode. Detours family, hello and welcome to episode number 4 of season 3.
Wow, we're plugging along.
We are plugging right along.
Hi guys, it's Deb.
Yes, my beautiful wife Deb is here with me as always. Welcome to episode number 4. As you can see by the graphic, this is an episode on the story of Samson. Samson and Delilah. Delilah's only one chapter in Judges, but she's such a huge part of the story that everybody knows that they typically tack it on to the end.
Yeah.
But this is going to be more of a
story of Samson.
Yeah, definitely a character study of Samson, but Delilah is certainly a huge part of that. Mm-hmm. But he is a story that virtually everyone knows on some variation or another.
That's true. It's kind of like Jonah. Everyone has the story of Jonah.
Everyone knows it. Everybody knows Samson.
David and Goliath, Daniel and the lion's den. Yes. Samson's one of those stories.
Yes, and
it's gonna be fun to unpack.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely going to be fun. He's a unique character, to say the least.
For sure.
Got a lot of interesting traits about him. I think he's, you mentioned David and Goliath. It was victory. Some of the, a lot of these, Daniel in the lion's den, victory, so on and so forth. But Samson and Delilah, I guess you would say there's almost some negative connotation that comes along with that name and that story, because it's
sure,
certainly a pattern of failures that we see. But I think he's a very interesting character. I think he's very underrated. I mean, he's in the Hall of Faith, right?
He is, Hebrews 11.
So there's definitely part of his story that we're not getting.
There's probably about 20 years of him being a judge that we don't even see or hear about. And God pulls out this part of the story to teach us.
Yeah, which I guess that's what we got to go on. So that's what we're going to dive into in this episode. But me, I love my context.
You do, and so do I. I think it's so important to understand what you're reading and what the history is, so you have a better, well-rounded viewpoint of what's going to happen in the story.
Yeah, so fill us in, Deb. You've done some research just on the Philistines, Samson's relationship, Israel's relationship with the Philistines. Give us some of that background.
I will. The book of Judges covers about 330 years of Israel's history. And really, it's on the heels of a really incredible season that the children of Israel have with Joshua and their obedience to the Lord. And as you get to Judges, you see this constant disobedience and running back to God and disobedience. And when I say disobedience, I'm talking about God uses the phrase in his book, in Judges, that they prostituted themselves with idols, with Baal and Ashtaroth and Dagon and all of these things that bring them to a place of where, just like the Philistines, they're seeking after something that they already have in Yahweh. So you're going to see that God raises up people in the book of Judges. There's even Deborah, who's incredible. So if you have an opportunity as a listener, make sure to kind of check out some of the really cool stories that are in there. But Samson is definitely something that stands out in the book of Judges. He's got the cool, birth announcement. There's only a few people in the Bible that have this birth announcement. You have Isaac, John the Baptist, Jesus, where there's a pre-announcement to, hey, this child is coming and he's going to be, the purpose is stated. And Samson's purpose was to be a deliverer from 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 Israel's enemies, which happened to be the Philistines at the time.
And he does do that.
Yes.
He does get them there, but he definitely follows the trend that is the last verse of the book.
They did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah, and Samson certainly follows that trend that you'll see. And you know, you have to sit and wonder, what would his life have been like
if he had just been obedient?
Yeah, if he had just been obedient.
Yeah.
But before we go down and start unpacking that,
he's a Nazirite. Is that what you wanted to get to?
Yep, he's a Nazirite.
Okay.
So go down that path of Nazirite versus.
So that was the announcement,
Yeah.
you know, to his parents, who were very faithful. Who his mom was barren for a long time, and then she's blessed with Samson, and he is to be a Nazirite. And a Nazirite is someone consecrated to God. They are set aside for his service and his purpose. They are not to touch the fruit of the vine. So no wine, no raisins, no fruit of the vine. They are to touch nothing that's dead. No dead bodies, no dead animals. So they were never to touch like an animal sacrifice. And he was not to cut his hair. His hair was a symbol of him being a Nazirite, and it was a symbol of his consecration. And so his hair was not to be touched. And those were the basic tenets of, you know, being a Nazirite.
Yeah, and so knowing all of that, the birth announcement that you were referring to earlier, that's covered in chapter 13. We're going to kind of skip over that to get the study on Samson himself.
Yes.
Which begins in chapter 14. Right out of the gate, the very first words out of his mouth to his parents are, "I have seen a woman, go get her for me." And I want her. And she is a Philistine woman. So if he's consecrated and set aside, he's not supposed to compromise. And right out of the gate, he compromises due to the sin of lust.
Right.
There's a tremendous book out there called, I believe it's called Every Man's Sin. That talks about how every single man struggles with lust, right? Men are more visual, for sure. And Samson's no different. As a matter of fact, he's probably the extreme here.
Right. And I think we misinterpret lust as only sexual desire and something that's really a man thing, but it's so not, especially in this culture. I mean, I've struggled with lust in the past, and it's a longing, it's a strong desire, so insatiable that you can't quench it, and that you would put it in front of anything else because ultimately it becomes an idol. And that's really the picture of idolatry. And women, for him, man, they're his kryptonite. They're just...
That's definitely the trend that he sets. He definitely has these trends that he has to break, and he never does. And it's his downfall over and over and over again.
And I think it's important to know that even if it was an Israelite woman, I mean, like he chose God's enemy, the Philistines, who hated Yahweh. And God always told his people, do not intermarry. And it was never about race. It was always about relationship. He did not want people to draw his people away from him. Like, I think it's in Exodus. It's Exodus like 34:14, where God says, "You shall worship no other gods, for I'm the Lord, and my name is jealous. I am a jealous God." And I never want people to misinterpret that. Like, God is not jealous of us or of other gods. He's jealous for us. He wants us to know him because he's the God of the universe. And so here he goes. He finds a Philistine woman who's got to be good looking and says, "I want her. Get her for me." And his parents are like, "Can't you pick a woman from our own family over here?"
Yeah.
I mean, I'm putting in the Jersey, New York accent, but they probably had their own accent.
I'm pretty sure that was it. And, you know, what's amazing is the verse reads, you know, when he's speaking, he says, "She pleases me well." That's literally Samson saying, well, she's right in my eyes.
Exactly.
She's going to be great for me. And we've all been in those relationships that we think are good relationships, but every single person around us goes, what are you doing here?
Yes.
You need to run from this. So Samson is no different.
Right.
He may be extreme, but he's very relatable because we've all been in those relationships that just were not healthy.
Yeah, red flags all over the place, and we're like, yeah, but I want her, or I want him.
And he had his red flags. A, she was Philistine. B, his parents tried to talk him out of it. And he just demands this Philistine wife. And even that, he's not honoring his mother and his father.
He's not honoring his God.
So many things going on there.
Yeah.
But it's quite amazing just how much resistance he gives just within the first 3 verses of this chapter. It's hard to read because you want to root for Samson. I want to root for Samson.
Yeah.
He comes, I mean, he's this gladiator figure.
Right.
That is being used to get God's work done.
Right.
Even though he's way off base, God's completely in control. God knew ahead of time. He had the solutions prepared before Samson was ever even born, knowing that Samson was going to have this issue with lust. And
he still chose to use him. And that's a great lesson for us, that even in our struggles, God chooses to use us and entrust us with missions on his behalf. And so nobody is too broken. Like, God wants a willing participant, of course. And you can see some willingness in Samson, even though he wavers in that. But, it's a good message for us because we're broken people and God can still use us.
Yeah. And him going after a Philistine woman, this always goes back to you and I are so passionate about being a single Christian and just how much of a blessing that season in people's lives are. There's so much pressure to find a significant other and so on and so forth. And yes, that's absolutely a wonderful thing. But I know plenty of Christians that are happy being single. I know plenty of Christians that are struggling, and
there's both sides of the coin.
There's many sides to that coin, but I think what's so important here is the reason it's important to honor what God says in a relationship and you got to date other Christians is then the most intimate part of my life is my relationship with Christ. The most intimate part of your life is your relationship with Christ. And so we put Christ at the center, his values, everything, he's given us the playbook to life, and we share the same playbook.
Right. So we're walking in the same direction together.
Yes.
I think there's a verse that says, how can 2 people walk together if they don't agree? And being someone who has been with, in a relationship that's unequal in their faith, the Bible calls it unequally yoked. It is painful. It is painful.
And we see that multiple times between wives and even a prostitute and so on and so forth. And it's not even like it's not that someone that isn't a Christian isn't capable of being in a healthy relationship.
Yeah, that's not what we're saying at all.
That's not what we're saying, and that's not why God says Christians stick with fellow Christians. It's simply what you were just saying. When we both have the same playbook and both of us are looking at, a compass, you don't want it to be Jack Sparrow's compass that points to the thing that you want most in this world. You need a true compass that points north. And if we're both looking at that,
right,
when you're off base, I can show you the compass and softly correct you. And you can do the same thing for me. And you have your heading, you know how to make that correction. And that's the heart behind God's recommendation here.
Yes.
Why he set Samson aside, to not be with Philistine women, is he wanted Samson to have a woman that would love and support him and give him the same direction.
Sure. Always pointing back to Jesus. Well, in this case, God. Yeah. And then as he's getting this wife, he has to cross through a couple of cities to get to her. And he goes through a vineyard of all things. He's not supposed to be anywhere near grapes. He goes through a vineyard. He takes his parents with him, and he wrestles a lion. And I think that probably freaked him out, because it was probably the first time he had this supernatural strength given to him by God. And he just snaps this lion in half.
Yeah, we don't know whether or not he had supernatural power before this, but this is the first time that...
Now, how is a man going to wrestle a lion without God's strength on him?
And so this is the first time that we hear that, that Samson has God's favor upon him. So whether or not he had superhuman strength before that or not, we don't know. But This is the first reference to it. And this is the first time we see it coming out, is him just annihilating this lion, which is so amazing. But it fades into the backdrop of all this other stuff.
It does. And it could have been such a key central point for him to go, wow, God is with me. And yet he overlooks it because he's driven by his lust to get to this woman and marry her.
And the sweet taste of honey, even that is a mess. So he kills this lion, and I guess he leaves, and he comes back, and you pointed out earlier, as a Nazirite, he is set aside. He's not supposed to touch a carcass.
Right.
And he does. He compromises yet again. So he's going after this, this Philistine woman. That's a compromise. God's favor comes upon him. He kills this lion, but then he immediately turns right around and compromises again and goes back to this dead lion. He sees that there's honey.
Right.
A beehive has formed inside the carcass of the lion. Mm-hmm. And so he has to touch the dead animal.
Right.
And he so easily.
Well, one compromise typically leads into another compromise. And I think the honey represents that, sometimes sin does taste sweet, and sometimes it is enticing, And
it's not even his first compromise, because it is in a vineyard.
That's true. True.
He's not even supposed to be in that area.
Right.
He compromises that and then sees the carcass of the lion that he kills. And then, and then on top of that, gives the honey to his parents and doesn't tell them where it came from.
Ew, gross.
He hides it from them.
So gross.
But how true is that of
sin?
Sin. It's especially things like lust. That's Samson's Achilles heel. So let's stick with that. If you have an addiction to heroin, you got to go down to the street corner. You got to go somewhere else to get your fix. But nowadays, you could be watching a football game, and the commercials that they show during that game are
so sexually charged.
In pornography, you can access that from your fingertips. You don't even have to get up from where you are.
I know, it's insidious.
It really is. As an employee of the church, so many people want to talk about, sexuality and so on and so forth right now, but I don't see anything inside the church that's more of a threat than pornography. And nobody talks about it.
Yeah, sometimes I hear them talk about it. I think they should be talking about it much, much more. And there should be an outlet for people to be honest and open and say, hey, I really do have a problem, and I'm so ensnared, and I can't seem to stop myself. And that would be nice if we started to really address that in a much more open, vulnerable, this is reality. This is happening. There's 7-year-olds addicted to pornography now. I mean, this is really happening. And if we want to help people combat it, we have to be willing to talk about it. It's not something we whisper. It's something that we shout from the pulpits. This is sin, and this needs to be addressed.
It needs to be taken very, very seriously. And you know, but Samson's reaction is probably the average person, very much their reaction. Well, let me just not talk about it.
Yes.
He cuts corners and just kind of looks at it and goes, well, I'm going to keep on going.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't bother to tell his mom and dad where the honey came from. And he even invites them to have a taste.
Yep.
It's crazy. I mean, so sad.
Yeah, it is sad. And his parents, if they would have known, they would have been mortified because his mother and father were Nazarites. So
yeah,
he draw them right into breaking their vow, and they didn't even realize it.
And so not only does he not tell his parents, but next we come to the riddle, and it's almost like he's holding it in front of people and boastful without talking about it. He has this riddle.
Right. Well, so for people who don't know the story, he finally does get down to Philistine, or is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And he
went down to Philistine.
Yeah,
his Philistine friends are there at basically a bachelor party.
Right.
Because he's on the way to get...
gonna get married.
Get married, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And then at the bachelor party where he's drinking and hanging out with people who hate God, he has this riddle about the lion and basically is prideful that he knows no one can figure it out. So he's almost waving his sin like a banner. And they don't know what this riddle is. And he gambles, hey, I want to gamble some suits. In modern language, it would be suits. I'm sure it's tunics or whatever. And nobody can figure it out.
Yeah, and what's amazing here, the way it reads in most commentaries, he's actually not drinking wine. He's drinking beer here.
Okay.
So
it's not a grape, but he's still drinking.
Drinking is just don't do it. Especially when you're one of God's chosen. Working for a church, I would find it really difficult to sit there and spend someone's hard-earned tithing money to go get drunk. I get paid based off of other people's tithes. So for me to go down to the bar and just have a few cold ones, it makes my skin crawl. And yet Samson, whether it's beer or wine here, he's not making the right decisions.
No, again, because one sin lays on top of another, and it becomes much easier to sin once you get started. It's like a snowball.
Yeah, and so he's sitting there kind of dangling the lion and the honey in front of these guys at this bachelor party, if you will. And he says in verse 12, let me pose a riddle to you. He's talking to these guys at the bachelor party. Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. That's what you were referring to earlier. It might be a tunic or so on and so forth. But if you can't explain it to me, then you got to give me the 30 tunics, basically, paraphrasing.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. And so he poses this riddle to these guys, and my goodness.
Knowing that he's the only one that has the answer, how would anyone get this riddle?
No, that's just it.
So it's very arrogant. It's done to humiliate them. So he's already starting with, let me gamble, let me party, let me humiliate them. He's very cocky.
Very. And so basically we know it's a lose-lose for these guys.
Right.
So let's insert the first
Woman.
wife.
Right.
This is the first wife. She basically extracts the answer of the riddle. That's the only way it can get solved. And
Extracts. I like that.
she basically, she wears him out.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if I can find it. What does it say? I can't find.
Why won't you tell me? Don't you love me?
Yeah. Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, You only hate me. You don't love me. He tells her, and the Bible says, because she pressed him so much. That's the Bible's gentle way of saying she nagged. And it's amazing because Delilah does the same thing and he gives in again. It's definitely that's the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
But what a terrible example of communication and trust. Like, everything about this relationship is wrong.
Well, yeah. And again, because number one, they didn't start off on the same foundation. So you have two different worldviews coming together, and there's probably, I don't see a whole lot of premarital happening. Mom and dad don't want them to get married. And you have this lack of communication. Like, if you loved me, you would tell me. Well, maybe if you didn't, get married right away, you'd have some foundation for trust and love. But
men desire to be respected in relationships. Women desire to be loved.
Yep.
And it translates to the same feeling. And neither is happening here. He clearly doesn't love her, and she clearly doesn't respect him.
Right. And it's a cycle.
It's just, yes, it's on repeat. You're watching the same thing over and over and over again. But again, there are so many wrong pieces to this relationship that why would they get this one right?
Right. And I think it's something for us to glean from and learn from in a relationship, that love and respect go hand in hand. And unless you have those components, it's going to be a hamster on a wheel type of relationship.
And what's so sad is you see that so much. We've all been at the grocery store and seen, the couple that they're maybe in their 60s, 70s, whatever it may be. And clearly it's been a hamster wheel relationship where the conversation back and forth, there's no life being spoken on either side. And it just makes you cringe when you're in line at Publix or Albertsons, wherever you go. We've all seen it. It's a very real thing. And it continues. So she gets him to give her the answer to the riddle.
Right.
And talk about no respect. Like a Rodney Dangerfield moment. I don't get no respect. She immediately runs to the Philistines and gives them the answer to the riddle.
Yeah.
And, the Bible has, there are just certain lines in the Bible where you just go, okay, oh wow. And here's one from Samson. And I really got to get your perspective as a woman on this one.
I'm ready to hear it.
He basically is talking with the bachelors. They've solved the riddle, and his response is he should insert his foot before he says this. But he says this: if you had not plowed with my heifer.
He calls his wife a heifer.
You would not have solved my riddle. My goodness, Samson.
Right. You want my perspective of it? Talk about
you would have smacked. I can't even. You would be running around with a pan, whacking me on the back of the head if
you called me a heifer. I probably.
Gosh.
You could see the lack of love. How do you call someone you've chosen to be in covenant with a heifer?
Again, speaking life, there is no life being spoken by any of these characters.
Yeah.
Every word out of their mouths is meant to chop away at the other.
That is true. And it's just so amazing because there's verses in the Bible that I can point out about marriage that I've hung my hat on, and one of them, even though we're talking about Samson saying something very nasty to this woman who doesn't have a name, but the thing that I stand on often is every wise woman builds her home and every foolish one tears it down with her own hands. And she basically was tearing down her house, and he was treating her like garbage and recipe for disaster. I mean, period. And you just think about how many times things can be said and they can't be unsaid. You can't put the words back in your mouth. And life and death are in the power of the tongue, and those that love it will eat its fruit. I mean, once you say something that hurtful, the person either is going to retaliate or retreat. There's really, and if they're retreating, they're typically not going to trust you again.
Yeah, and so we've listed off here for 30 minutes just all these mistakes that Samson makes, and you get to verse 19, and he's making just a terrible mistake.
Mm-hmm.
The anger and revenge kick in, and what's absolutely amazing is as he's making this mistake, verse 19 starts off with, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily." So even in the midst of a terrible mistake, Christ was with him and was still showing him favor.
And mercy, grace, favor, compassion. It's amazing.
It's staggering.
It is.
Really is staggering. So if you don't know this story, Samson gets really angry and basically loses his bet. So he has to give these 30 tunics, these 30 outfits to these guys. So what he does is he goes and he kills 30 Philistines, disrobes them, takes those, and that's the payment that he makes for losing this bet. So all of a sudden, we've got a Hatfield and McCoy's situation brewing here.
Right, bloodshed.
Because Samson just, he cannot control. He gives into every urge, and this urge just so happens to be anger. And yet the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. Mercy. Absolutely amazing.
Mercy
Absolutely
upon
amazing.
mercy. It always amazes me that people go, well, the God of the Old Testament is so different than Jesus in the New Testament. And it's like, no. Compassion and mercy and grace and favor was upon Samson and upon the Israelites, even in the midst of their rebellion. As long as they repent, God opens his arms and welcomes his people back. And yet you see this mercy. I mean, he just murdered people for a bet, and yet God is still with him. And that is something that really strikes me as like, I do serve a loving God. I do serve a favorable God.
Yep. And so Samson kills these 30 men, gives the tunics over to pay for the bet.
And then the revenge cycle just snowballs.
Yeah. So his wife leaves him.
Well, his wife is given to his best man, I guess.
Yeah.
And then they murder his parents.
They meaning
the Philistines, yes.
So, the Philistines go and murder his parents.
So talk about the immense consequence of sin. Like your sin affects your whole sphere of influence. Like his poor parents, they say, don't marry this girl. Don't do it. And yet every choice he makes up until that point is their demise. That breaks my heart. That sin has such an outreach, I mean...
And it just snowballs.
Fast and furious.
It just snowballs. And so all of a sudden, all this retaliation happens back and forth. Samson clearly sees that his wife has been given to his best man and just freaks out. Just absolutely freaks out.
Then kills he kills 1,000 people with a jawbone of an ass.
He does. Before even all of that happens, though, Samson goes, and it has one of the more, I'm saying the same things over and over again today. I can't believe it. But he he catches 300 foxes. That's a line in the Bible that I just go, wait a second. I need more detail, because that's all it tells us. It just says, then, this is in verse 4, then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put the torch between each pair of their legs, basically sets them loose, and they go burn all these crap. Hold on a minute.
How fast does he have to run to grab 300 foxes?
Or how long does it? Like, I need more detail here.
I can't wait to find out. I know God will tell us when we get there.
It's got to be so fascinating.
For sure.
This is one of those, this is one of these details that the Bible just brushes over, and you're like, wait a minute.
I want to know more.
What just happened? But he takes these 300 foxes, basically puts a torch, ties them together, puts a torch between their tails. They're each going to run in a different direction, and it burns down all these crops. And then the Philistines retaliate. They go and they kill Samson's wife and his family. Then Samson gets now we're to your point of the 1,000 Philistines.
Wow.
Samson goes and kills 1,000 Philistines. And in Hebrew, it translates to with the moist jaw of an ass. So this was a recently deceased jawbone.
The word is, they use moist?
Yeah, the Hebrew word translates to moist.
Ew.
That's one of those cringe words.
I hate that word.
Yeah, so he's got this, and what's amazing is Samson's running around with this jawbone killing Philistines when he is the jawbone in God's hands. Mm-hmm. And even in the midst of all of this sin and all of this, he is so consumed with anger and revenge, still got lust in his heart, all of these things, God's still with him. God's still hanging in there, and he's so patient. Again,
that gives us great hope for us.
Yeah, just when you sit there and you're struggling with this sin that you've struggled with for so long, have hope because of a story like this is the area where I think Samson gets such a bad rap, because of Delilah, because of so many of these things that he does. But the picture that's painted here, to your point earlier, of God and how patient, how long-suffering he is, you have to almost, you're in the middle of doing like 50 consecutive face palms because Samson, you're just like, I can't believe he did this again. But rather than just focus on Samson, you have to pump the brakes and just look at the heart of God.
Yeah. How
he's continuing to work, and he's taking out the Philistines with this man that has an anger problem.
Yeah.
And yeah, Samson was absolutely a jawbone in God's hands. And what happens next is staggering to me, where his own people, the Philistines, want Samson, and his own people turn him over and give him to the Philistines.
Wow, there's a lot of picture of that in our own culture. I mean, we are so quick to cancel people, to humiliate people. I think our lust for social media has given us like this false sense of bravery, and instead of coping with things that bother us, we type behind a screen, and we give up our other Christian friends because, well, we don't agree with the way you interpret the Bible, or we don't like this about what you're doing. And so instead of having that true interaction in community and being one in community, his own community turned on him.
Look at what's going on in Israel right now.
Yeah.
They were attacked, and the entire world is slowly turning on them.
They were attacked in their own land, and they're defending themselves.
Can you imagine what the United States would have said to the rest of the world after 9/11 when we decided we were going after Osama bin Laden, and there was no talking us out of it.
Yeah.
Nobody turned to us and said, United States, you got no business. Women and children are dying because you're bombing, you're raiding, you're doing all these. Nobody. And that was less than 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened in Israel, when you put it on a sliding scale, there's 6 million Israelites over there in Israel right now. And the number that were taken in September 11th, it was 2 airplanes flying into a building, or into multiple buildings.
Right.
These people in Israel were taken hostage.
Mm-hmm.
They were raped.
Yep.
Who knows what was done to all of these people?
Beheaded, captured, tortured.
Yeah, and yet they're standing up to the people that attacked them,
mm-hmm.
and the rest of us are trying to sit there and
judge.
Shake our fingers at them and judge. And it's not exactly the same, but you see the theme that's happening there, the corruption of man, and how it is a phenomenon that when someone stands up to evil, people are angrier at the person that stands up than they are the oppressor.
And he was meant to be the deliverer. Like, he's a judge of Israel. Like, he's meant to be the warrior and the deliverer, and they turn on him. And ultimately what they're doing is they're turning on God's man. And even though God's man's not behaving, he was called for this purpose. He was set aside for this purpose to be the deliverer of Israel, and they're turning on him. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I think we kind of went out of order there. The first thing that happens is Samson surrenders over to the Philistines, and then that's when he kills 1,000 people. So I think we kind of got ahead of ourselves there. That's when he uses the jawbone of the donkey. But at the end of all of this, Samson comes face to face with his humanity. He kills these 1,000 Philistines, and verse 18 leads off with saying, then he became very thirsty, and finally he cries out to the Lord.
Yeah, and all this time you don't hear him praying or worshiping or crying out to God at all.
Or talking to a priest.
Right.
What was it? You were, I think you were talking about, just he's given so much authority with no accountability.
That's right. He is. He's got nobody that is holding him accountable for his spiritual walk. And he does. He has a whole lot of authority. And you don't see anything in there where there's some checks and balances. And that's so important in our walk of faith, is that we have people who love us enough to keep us accountable to the authority God's given us to share his word, to be an example, to be a light. And you can see that there isn't anyone in his life, and he's not seeking counsel. He's not seeking wise counsel. At least we're not shown that.
And even when he did, like his parents at the very beginning, he didn't listen to him. They tried to talk him out of the Philistine wife, and he wanted nothing to do with it. So who knows? Maybe he did have it. He just didn't bother to listen, but we certainly don't see it.
Right. And he has this consecration being set aside for God, and you don't see the communion with God. So you have authority and no accountability. You have consecration and no communion. Like he's really not in a good position spiritually. He's become very spiritually blind. And we're going to see later on in the story that he winds up being physically blinded, and that all the things that happened to him, as we'll get to that part of the story here in just a second, is so much a picture of sin.
Yeah, and so you see Samson getting thirsty, and again, this is just God reminding him that he is human, that he does need God. And even though you certainly can't read tone when you're reading the verses, but if I read tone at the end of chapter 15, I picture Samson whining there. God, I just did all of this. What, am I going to die of thirst now?
Like the Israelites, what are we not going to have our leeks and onions?
Yeah.
You left me in the desert to die? Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely has that moment. And so, all right. So now Samson is on his way to Gaza. And the lust thing rears its head twice in this chapter alone. The very first part of chapter 16 is a harlot that he sees in Gaza. That's the word that the Bible uses to describe this woman as a harlot.
A prostitute.
Yep. She's a prostitute. And so Samson gives in to sin again. And when the Bible says they're talking about Samson's enemies. They surround the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. How close is that to a picture of sin? Again.
Yeah. I mean, what does the Bible say about Satan? He's a roaring lion waiting and roaring to see who he can devour. And that's a paraphrase, of course, but that's what sin does. It lies in wait.
Yeah. And it literally says here, they were quiet all night, saying, in the morning when it's daylight, we will kill him. So they're literally sitting there lying in wait because they know that Samson has this lustful heart and he's in there with this harlot, with this prostitute.
When your reputation becomes so predictable that people know how to take you down, you're in a very bad place. And he is in a predictable pattern to the point where they know, And that's how the enemy gets us. When we continue to repeat the same patterns and we continue to run after the same idols. Obviously, his idol is lust and women. Very easy to take down someone who continues to strive at the same sin. And that's what the enemy does. He finds our patterns.
And the pattern of God is, but I'm still going to show up. And he's still with Samson because what happens is he gets up at midnight. He's just been with this prostitute. He gets up at midnight, and here's another verse in the Bible where I wish they gave you more detail, and they don't.
Right.
Samson gets up at midnight, and he takes hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. What the heck?
I know.
So based on what we know about Nineveh and some of these other cities at the time, average gate size is about 15 feet high. There's two gates. Let's take the lightest material it would be, which would be wood. A 15-foot high gate made of wood, and the two gateposts. So when I read the two gateposts, all I can think about is watching like ESPN3 at 2:00 in the morning.
Oh, the strongest man contest. I love those.
Where they have the giant poles and they have to run and how far can they throw this pole?
Yeah.
Right. So I figure it's something, let's just say it's comparable to that. Those strong men, they can only carry one, and they're really not carrying it very far before they try and toss it who knows how many feet. Samson not only has one, he has two gateposts and the gates.
Right. And you're being generous that it's wood because it's not wood. It's, city gates were meant to be fortresses. They're not using wood. But you're being very generous.
Yeah. And he carries them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron.
It's about 40 miles.
Yes. Hebron is about 40 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
This is another thing like the Fox is like, okay,
give me more.
How long did this take? Was he doing a brisk walk? Is he running and sprinting, carrying the
Well, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, so maybe he was hustling.
Maybe he was floating if the Spirit of the Lord was on him.
Sure, I mean, we don't know.
But 40 miles, carry, this is, right, this is Hercules.
Yeah.
This is something Hercules would do. And here he is. And immediately, this is immediately following after being with a prostitute. God's still with him, giving him this level of strength. And all right.
And let's get to the point where, like, do we ever sit back and judge Samson? Like, why would God still be with you? Like, it's so easy to just look at the shortcomings. And like you said earlier, like, we could focus all on the shortcomings, but like, wow, look at God doing that for someone. And we're capable of all these sins. We're capable of lust and revenge and
anger,
rage,
yes,
and
absolutely,
pridefulness, and all the things that we see that and it does sound like we're judging Samson, but in all reality, we are all capable of these things, and many times we have done these things in our own lives. And yet, but God is there saying, you're my child, and I need you to come back to me and walk with me. And he's patient. I mean, more patient than humanity can wrap their brain around.
Yep. And so sandwiched in between these two giant sins of women is God still being there with him.
Yes.
So the second side of that sandwich is insert Delilah.
Yes, Delilah. I got to think that Delilah had to be good looking. I mean, there's no way that
my gosh,
she got this guy to cut her hair. She had to be a fox. If people even say that phrase anymore, she had to be hot.
You'd like to think so. And this is also the very first time that the word love is used for Samson. So this woman is different. There was no love with the prostitute. There was no love mentioned with the first wife.
Right.
But there's love mentioned here in verse 4.
Okay.
So this means she's on a different level.
Right. And she has more of his heart. She
has his heart, and she's a fox.
There you go.
Trouble.
Trouble.
So the Philistines give her a proposition. It basically reads, entice him, find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him. That's the way this reads.
Mm-hmm.
And so she basically goes to Samson. She agrees to do it. So Delilah, we get the first insight of Delilah we get with a sin of hers,
right,
which is her love of money.
Right.
There's 1,100 pieces of silver being offered to her.
Per person.
That's the way it reads.
Right.
Every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. I don't know if that's meaning collectively we'll give you 1,100 pieces or if each one. Let's say it's just the 1,100 pieces. Each one of those pieces of silver would have weighed about 2 ounces, so 2,200 ounces of silver. Multiply that by $25 an ounce.
Oh, Mike, you're getting all mathy on me. I love it.
Yes.
How much money we talking here?
52 grand, so
that's a lot of money. Even now, 52 grand's that's a chunk.
52 grand sans inflation back then.
Yeah,
that's
a lot of money.
And so she shows one of her cards.
Yep.
Which is she has
greed.
An idol that is money, a.k.a. greed. So she agrees.
And she follows the same pattern as wife one, is getting to Samson's weakness. I entice. I can only assume, and this is why I said she is hot. You don't entice someone if you're not good. I mean, listen. She was probably very sexually forward. She enticed him however she saw fit for that money. And he was, again...
Ugly's not a temptation.
That's true. Let's just be honest. Let's put the cards on the table.
Yeah, ugly's not a temptation. So she's clearly not ugly.
Yeah.
And Yeah. So, and there's this, basically the same thing happens 3 times over. So we're not going to go into each
No.
one because time doesn't permit. But basically, she's asking him what's the source of his strength.
Mm-hmm.
The first 2 times he lies to her, gives her a story, and what's staggering is she literally says, "Please tell me where your great strength lie, and how you may be bound to afflict you." Samson, he was a smart man. He was, because he was a judge over Israel for 20 years. That's found, I believe it's right in the previous chapter in 15.
Right.
He reigns over as a judge for 20 years. He's not a stupid man.
But his lust overrides his intellect. And that's what lust can do. Like, lust can take you places you don't want to go, and you know better. And your brain goes, I shouldn't be doing this. But your flesh goes, but I want this. And just like he said with the first woman, I saw her, I want her. And that's what's happening, is the lust is overriding his intellect for sure. And if he loves her, he's not guarded his heart. I mean, Proverbs 4:23 is guard your heart for above all else, for all of, I'm paraphrasing again, forgive me, but everything flows from it.
He doesn't guard his heart, and he doesn't guard his mind.
Yeah.
Neither one. Because the what is it? The heart will always make a convert of the mind.
Always.
Whatever you desire in your heart, your heart will
convince yourself, convince your mind to move forward in it.
It will turn a convert into, it'll turn your mind into a convert, and you will talk yourself into.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Samson literally he winds up giving in, but she's literally saying, "Tell me what you can be bound with."
Right.
And he gives into this.
It's baffling.
It's absolutely baffling. And again, we're not going to go into all 3 instances. They're back to back to back.
But that does take us back to the pattern he had with his first wife. He was nagged.
That's it. Again, it says here, she pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart. But I laugh because it's so unbelievable. But the underlying theme here is for married people, not only is nagging toxic, but every time, if I were to nag you, and over time, and eventually you give in,
right?
When you give in and give me what I want, you're also placing a brick on this wall in between the two of us.
Very well said. Absolutely.
And
it takes a long time to bring those bricks down.
And most people avoid doing that because it's difficult conversation.
Right.
It's coming to terms with the fact that you had a role to play in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The brick isn't put there without the nagging to begin with. And nagging happens both ways.
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's TV in Hollywood or what it is, but when I use the word nag, most people will default to a woman
Female.
nagging her husband.
Right.
And yes, that absolutely does happen, but you can't convince me that a man doesn't nag a woman about the way she looks.
Yeah, or about
going out on a
sex,
date.
or about money, or about the house. There's tons of things that both sides of the fence, can choose to nag about. And really, the reality is, and someone said it to me the other day, it was, you know what, say it, pray it, don't say it.
Yeah.
That was her motto. And that's how she lives her life. And I'm like, that is blessed right there.
Yeah, and it's such a toxic environment, and so it causes Samson to give in,
Mm-hmm.
and he tells her his secret, cutting of his hair. So lo and behold, what does she do? She cuts his hair, and he loses his source of strength, and so he's arrested by the Philistines.
Right.
And now we come to, I guess you would say, the climax of the story.
Mm-hmm.
You may argue that it's the cutting of the hair, but here the climax of the story is his death. So he's seized by the Philistines. He's taken by the Philistines, and he has no strength. What's the first thing they do? They pluck out his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness, that's such a metaphor for sin.
Sure. I mean, everything that they do to him, sin is present. Listen, they bind him, right? Samson's tied up. That's exactly what sin does. It binds us. It traps us, and you almost can't get free of it. We were talking about like the porn addiction and drugs and how much it ensnares you. It blinds you. Sin blinds you. They gouge out his eyes.
To me, the saddest verse in all these chapters of Samson is verse number 20, where she basically says, she's cut his hair, and she says, the Philistines are upon us. And it says, so he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. He didn't even realize that God's spirit had left him.
That's very sad.
He was so blind and so arrogant that he thought he was going to get up like every other time, even though he had just poured his heart out and she had cut his hair. He's like, well, God's going to be with me. And he goes out, and all of a sudden he looks around, and yes, God's there with him, but his favor's not
Right.
anymore.
Right. I mean, he was spiritually blind long before his eyes were gouged out.
Oh, verse 1.
Yeah.
Verse 1 of chapter 14. You see how blind he is.
And then you see, even in the process of this torture that they're going to commit on him, is he's grinding in prison. He's grinding grain. And it's like, isn't that a picture of sin? It grinds away at us. And they were so excited. They just wanted to parade him around, and they wanted to say, Dagon, my God, Dagon. He took down Samson. And basically they were mocking Yahweh. They were mocking God. And that was their whole purpose.
Yeah. So he's there. He's got his eyes plucked out. He's grinding grain. And it says the hair of his head began to grow again. And what's so amazing about that is repentance and forgiveness. Forgiveness of sin is immediate, but the price that you pay for sin is not.
That's true.
It's gonna continue.
There's a consequence to your sin.
If you have an adulterous affair and you genuinely repent, God forgives you in that instance, but you still have a lot of work to do with your spouse.
Right.
Look at David.
Oh, with Bathsheba, and then everything that happened as a consequence to that adultery. His family fell apart.
And I genuinely believe he was instantly forgiven, and his sin was as far as the east is from the west the minute he repented. But the ramifications,
there's still consequences to your sin, and God's not going to take away the consequence. We wouldn't do that to our own children.
No,
and we're earthly. I mean, our sin has to have consequences so that we don't touch the hot stove again.
Yeah.
That's the only way that we really understand, and that's the only way we learn. And when we look at it from a parent-child situation, my kid can touch the hot stove, and, he still has to deal with the pain and the bruising and the burn and the festering wound that happens from touching that hot stove. I can't take that away from him. That's what happens when you do that. And that's the problem with sin, is there's always a consequence that is more than we're willing to pay, and it lasts a lot longer than we want it to. And
Samson's no different.
Yeah.
Samson sitting there, he has to grind this grain, and he's just completely mocked, by the Philistines. And when we get to Samson's death, you see how lowly they thought of him, because they have this little boy lead him by the hand. And it's so amazing. If you lose any other sense, if you got COVID, you lost the sense of taste,
smell,
so on and so forth. But for the most part, you're
functioning.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So your Starbucks coffee it tastes like water. Okay. But when you lose sight, you have to have someone helping you all the time. And the Philistines give Samson this little boy. That's how lowly they thought of him. They were praising Dagon, as you mentioned, that delivered this, this enemy of Samson into their hands, and they thought so lowly. And Samson, he basically finally breaks and actually prays a prayer here.
A humble prayer.
A humble prayer. And son of a gun, if God isn't there and hears that prayer and has mercy on him.
Right. There's the repentant heart.
And Samson basically, he says, basically he wants to be put up against the pillars of the temple. Now, Philistine temples are very narrow and very, very long. So if you were to take out 2 pillars at the entrance, or anywhere else for that matter, the whole thing would absolutely collapse. And we know that on the roof there were 3,000 people on there. That's a lot of people. So how many were inside? Certainly Delilah's inside. Certainly all these people that schemed against him, they're all in there. And God hears his prayers of repentance and miraculously gives him favor one last time. And he pushes on these pillars, and this temple collapses.
Yep.
And he kills more Philistines in that one gesture than
he did in his lifetime.
Yep, than he did in his lifetime. And Samson is the pinnacle of underestimating sin. He underestimates his own sin, and yet God absolutely uses him to accomplish exactly what he needed to accomplish. He needed to take down that temple. He needed, just the idol worship that was going on there. The enemies of Israel that were there. He needed that done. And at the creation of the universe, he said, I'm going to create this guy that's going to be filled to the brim with sin, going to be arrogant, going to be lustful, going to be all these things. But he's going to accomplish exactly what I want him to accomplish.
Well, it almost sounds, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand you, it sounds like God made him sinful, where I know that's not what you intended, but just in case someone's listening and interpreted that way, we were all made in his image, and unfortunately we sinned, and that sin separated us from him, and we are living in that sin curse. And so despite his sin, God was going to use him. God was going to use him in a mighty way. And he already had that call on his life. Like I said, he had a pre-announcement of his birth that he was going to be a deliverer from these people that hated the Israelites and hated God. And God used him in a mighty, mighty way.
So much missed potential.
Yes, imagine if he was obedient. Like, imagine what his testimony and his story would have actually been if he had stayed consecrated to the Lord as a Nazirite.
He got, at least 3, arguably 4, if you want to include the announcement of his birth. But he got 3 chapters in the Bible being completely disobedient and filled with sin. What would his story have looked like if he was as dedicated as David was?
Yeah.
My goodness. So much missed potential.
Yeah, it's very sad, but it's also, it gives us hope that even at the end of it all, Samson is counted as faithful.
Yep, his heart was right towards God at the end.
Yep.
And he had faith. He prayed a very bold prayer, probably going, God, I don't deserve this, but one last time, can you show up?
Yeah.
And God heard that prayer, and Samson's heart had to have been very, very humble at that point.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes pain and struggle to get to humility.
But that's where he ends up.
Yep.
He ends up humble, ends up killing thousands of Philistines with his last breath, ends up in Hebrews in the Hall of Faith.
Yeah.
What an amazing story.
Really. Lots of things to learn and grow from.
Yeah. And again, just like kind of the theme of this whole season so far. Yeah, this story is thousands of years old.
But so relevant.
Lust and anger and...
There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, nothing new under the sun.
And if God can be faithful through all of our, struggles to Samson, he's going to do it for us too.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, that's not a license to go sinning by no means, but it does show the mercy of God and does show him to be loving and compassionate.
Absolutely. And I think that is a great way to end this episode. I love Samson. I feel so bad for how, his story goes in the Bible, because it's just, he does so few things correctly. But it is an amazing story.
It
Absolutely amazing. We hope we gave you guys some insight into something today, something that you could relate to, because I think Samson is so relatable today. We hope you guys were blessed by this study. We're going to be going into a sort of a mini series, I believe, next on the prodigal.
Yep.
We're going to go into the parable of the prodigal, and we're going to have 3 episodes. We're going to do one on the prodigal, one on the brother, and then one on the father.
Yes. Are we going to get all 3 in? I mean...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Absolutely. So those are going to be our next episodes coming up. So we hope you guys stick with us. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Detours. We appreciate you guys tuning in. And we will catch you with the parable of the prodigal on the next episode.
Yep. Take care, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Detours. For more content, you can find us on Spirit FM Radio, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Play, or on our website at detours.life. To view my writings or to contact me for public speaking engagements, visit my website at debmarsalisi.com.